best-selling author of 8 true crime books and a memoir. Before she began this part of her career, she was a broadcast journalist in New York City, Portland, and Seattle. She's taught at the Hugo House and North Seattle College and mentors many other writers. She often appears on television and in documentaries as a crime expert. I'd like to welcome everyone that's in the Zoom room right now. If you have any questions, you Zoomers, please send them in the chat directly to Emily at SBL. She'll ask your questions out loud for you. And lastly, I'd like to thank you for supporting programming at the Seattle Public Library. And welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Jason. Would anybody else in this area like to move up here? We've got snacks and coffee. I'm sorry, Jason. I'm taking that. Oh, well. Thank you. I spent my whole life in radio. You'd think I'd know how to do that. Anyway, hello to everybody in the Zoom room. Like about 40 people are joining us on Zoom tonight. So that's really great. And I'm waving. So the library asked me to talk about obituary writing. And it so happens that I am a kind of a fan of obituaries, which is maybe a little bit bizarre, but I read them. Nobody does them better than the New York Times. But I do suggest okay. Well, Jason, it's not moving. Anyway, I do suggest you watch an obituary that the New York Times produced about their obituary desk, their section, that's really wonderful. It's 3 or 4 years old. It's available. I can't seem to advance. Anyway, slight technical difficulties, which this happens. I wanted to say, first of all, that this is a pretty serious subject. There's usually a reason, and not always a positive one, that we're faced with writing an obituary. And I'm going to find some examples of how people broke the rules along the way. And there's kind of funny obituaries, but it's also a very solemn thing. And it's a very, thank you, can be a family, a joint effort, which you can imagine the letters that used to be written to Dear Abby in the day about siblings getting along when they're writing, their mother's obituary or something. But I'm very curious about people. That's why I've spent all these decades in journalism. And going back just a second, I love this quote that obituaries have next to nothing to do with death and absolutely everything to do with life. And I think once we've lived long enough, we know that's the truth. So I was a caregiver by age 28 for my first husband. And the first obituary I wrote was when I was 30, when he died. And just a few years later, I remarried, and that husband died. So the first one was after cancer. The second death was sudden death. And so, by 33, I'd written 2 husbands' obituaries. So that kind of qualifies me, I think, as an expert in at least, beginning to dip your toe in. And then since then, I've worked with my brother on our parents' obituaries. And then I've written my own, and my brother's written his, because he says nobody else will know the dates. When he was in the Navy or got out or when he moved to Seattle and those things. So it's very important if you're working with a loved one on their obituary to interview them, and to really take notes and get all the dates down. There's also a school of thought that I learned after I was widowed twice about writing your own obituary as a kind of therapeutic exercise. And I did that when I was 33, and I was already in journalism, but I could tell my life was not going to be what I thought it was. And I wrote my own obituary at 33, and I did change my trajectory in journalism. and went to graduate school, which I'd always wanted to do. And it's a really interesting experience, especially if you're younger, to write your obituary. And now I'm kind of fascinated with reading the obituaries of women, especially the paid obituaries in the New York Times that can go on for, they must cost thousands of dollars, the bottom of the page on Sundays. And because, these are women in the East who belonged to different clubs and did very interesting things. And they have summer houses, they have winter houses. So I think I'm kind of comparing my life to other women's lives at this stage. But I'm very happy with mine. But it's interesting to see what my contemporaries, some of them, uh, are leaving behind. So there's an article, I think we have a link to it for you, about uh, a woman essayist for the Times who wrote why she writes her obituary every year. So obituary literally means departure in Latin. It's always been, its roots are kind of a record, the announcement of a death. That's what it's always been for thousands of years. It's the announcement of a death, which is very important in society. In any size city or neighborhood or village or culture, um, it's a way of people knowing what's happening to their neighbors, their families, other people. I think it's a really important part of journalism that newspapers still carry obituaries. These days, with fewer papers, I know that my high school class has a Facebook page, and so does my brother's. We grew up in Corvallis, Oregon, and that there are people in our class that track the deaths, and that's how they get notified if for class members that don't live in a town or a city anymore that has a newspaper. Um, so you'll see in the Sunday Seattle Times, there are a couple of pages of obituaries, pictures, and columns. And so those are paid for by the family. And if you're working with a funeral home, they'll help you submit your obituary, or you can do it directly through the Seattle Times. I checked the rates today. An obituary, which is fairly short in the Times, starts at $249 and then goes up because of length and if you're going to have a picture. So it can be thousands of dollars. Um, but the difference is, if you saw Dan Evans died recently, and he didn't, have just a paid obituary. He had a big story because he was very important here in the Northwest. So that's not an obituary. That's a feature story that is also an obituary of Dan Evans. As I said, it can be a really cathartic. It can be an experience that brings people together if you're working with family members on this, or or it can be kind of um, a group project that turns a little bit difficult. You may have secrets in your family. As I was browsing obituaries online and odd obituaries, that sometimes the family just blurts out secrets. They take advantage of the obituary to tell secrets. Sometimes, of course, they don't. Um, and it's different, as I know, and that the circumstances, like the end of the long illness for my first husband and a sudden death. My second husband's was a sudden death. It's different. It's different. I don't remember turning to anybody for help or advice. My husband and I were both reporters, and I just wrote it. But I am aware that it can be a very emotional experience. So I was curious about how far back do obituaries go. Well, they go back to Roman days, and people would write them on papyrus and then take them to the village square where they would be shared with everybody, and not just births and deaths, but crimes and weddings. It's just always been a part of life. And sometimes they were carved on stone or metal, and again shared in the public square. And eventually, of course, we had the printing press in 15th century Europe. And I think obituaries have changed a lot, maybe especially the last 20 years. And I know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief have been appropriated and kind of turned on their head a little bit. And I always thought, it doesn't necessarily happen in those tidy 5 steps or in that order. But I think we've began to talk about death and dying, especially the last 10 or 20 years. And so our attitudes about obituaries changed too. They're much more candid. You'll see some very candid ones. In Victorian times, they were very brief, very brief death notices, didn't say much about the person. If there was a child, there might be just a poem or a biblical saying, and your family Bible may have what my family Bible has is photos that were taken after death because they never got a chance to take a picture of a child while they were living. So obituaries were, very, very religious in nature, very romantic, you might say, and flowery even sometimes. And I did not know this. The Civil War changed everything. Because there were up to 800,000 people killed in the Civil War, the latest research was 800 or 850,000, huge numbers of people missing and killed. And it was obituaries in the newspaper closest to you that where you would announce, somebody was missing or somebody had been killed or somebody was hospitalized. But it took the Civil War for this country to begin to really, that's the way they got in touch with families and loved ones and their community, is to put it in the paper of record, whatever that was. So the modern obituary evolved in the 1930s and 40s, and basically the who, what, when, where, why, and a lot of obituaries now mention what were the circumstances of death. And as I said, I just think it's terribly important to a community to read it. I've had a lot of friends tell me that they remember their parents, the newspaper arriving, and my parents took 2 newspapers. They were going in the Corvallis paper when I was growing up, and I don't remember that it's the first thing my parents read in the paper. They turned right to it. But I do have a number of pictures of my mother reading a newspaper, and enough of them that I made a little album for my brother one Christmas of just our mother reading the newspaper. But she loved to find out what was going on in the community, and that's, of course, one of the ways that you would find out. And, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, there were multiple editions of daily papers in cities like Chicago, especially Chicago and New York City. And I found a picture of the men on the train, commuting home from New York City, probably out to Long Island. And that's either the late edition of the day Kennedy was shot. I'm sure they did the timing. If it was 1 o'clock in Dallas, there was time to get 1 or 2 editions on the street in New York. And the occasion or the date, well, the one on the left says invasion on it, and I think it must be World War II, maybe the invasion of France. At one point I had a photo that the headline was about the invasion of France. And then, of course, the 2 papers, 2 consecutive days on 9/11, with the morning of 9/11 being, I forget what that picture, and it's out of focus here, but just some kind of gathering. And then, of course, everything changed. And I was a reporter in New York City, a radio reporter at that time. And well, I didn't go to Ground Zero for a couple of days, but we had other people there that I did eventually. And you may remember that the New York Times created just kind of happenstance, what they call portraits of grief. There were so many thousands of people killed, and how were they going to write about their deaths and not not just be one of 3,000, but to be your own your own obituary. So they invented the portraits of grief, and I remember them very well. That they started writing short obituaries on everybody who um, was confirmed lost. Of course, they found very few bodies or remains at ground zero. So, mostly people were in the airplanes and in the towers that went down and at the Pentagon. But they wrote 2,310 short obituaries of people, and they're still online at the Times, and it's been published as a book too, collected as a book. And it must have been a really hard assignment to call up family members within a few days or weeks of 9/11 and ask them to talk about, their dad or their mother or their spouse. But that was just an amazing, uh, it's a record. It's a permanent record of the people that died. So I think the way we talk about death has changed a lot over the years. There are lots of euphemisms that I sort of think are cliched. Passed away, they've gone home, dearly departed, they expired, um, they waged a brave battle. There still is a lot of that how hard they fought. And, people, it's not for me to say everybody can do what they want, write what they want, approach an obituary in the way they want. I just remember how when my first husband was dying, that's the era when they were telling children with cancer, you draw scenes of battle, draw, you're fighting these cancer cells, and then I think that was later kind of disregarded. That I mean, should we be talking about it as if it's
nicely. If I wanted to enhance it, I could, but I
Hey,
don't think
Julie, we
it's
see you have your hand
necessary.
raised. Do you want to
Here's the same
drop
image
your
on
question in the
cotton fabric
chat?
as opposed
It
to.
looks like you have the sound went off
You
for
can
me.
see
Okay.
the
Yeah, we'll get
texture of the
going in
fabric
just a
to
second. So sorry
change
about that,
the
everyone.
overall image.
Our
So
laptop in the front
it's almost the
just
same
died.
exactly. This
So
color
we're
wheel
turning
is
that back on right now,
slightly
and then we
more
should get
thick
us
than this
going
one.
back in just a few seconds. Sorry.
It's back.
Yeah, we're up.
question? Should one of them be, how do you want it phrased? Sure.
Hello.
I think sometimes people are reluctant to tell us. They're reluctant to talk about it too. They're reluctant sometimes to talk about it too, but yeah.
We're talking about
Okay, and surrounded by loved ones. So I know that that can be important. That, you know, nobody wants to think that anybody dies alone, and I've never seen died alone in an obituary, so maybe we're not that candid. But, you know, I guess I'm suggesting there are various ways, and find what you want and what you like and what your loved one is comfortable with. Um, I see cliches everywhere, and especially and defined by kind of, you know, gender. I mean, the obituaries I read about women are, you know, they were adored, they were cherished, they were treasured. They met their love of the love of their life. A lot of obituaries say, you know, she met the love of her life, or he met the love of her life. Well, I'm here to say, you know, there's more than one love of your life out there. Thank goodness, there is more than one love of your life. But again, and he, you know, the men are strong and athletic and successful and a devoted family man. And you know, I think a lot of times people are kind of talked up in obituaries, but we're a lot more frank about death now, and fewer taboos. I've seen obituaries that mention, well, quite a few now mention suicide or depression, or overdose, not just celebrities either, and or a specific disease. I was hoping a friend of mine, whose husband died suddenly this spring, I was helping her write his obituary, and he had gone into the hospital, been told he had pancreatic cancer, and died in 3 or 4 days. And she wanted me to, you know, I wasn't going to put in the cause of death. I'm the pancreatic cancer. I'm not sure. Um, I didn't necessarily. It wasn't something he, you know, fought for months or something. She said no. She wanted it in, so we put it in. And also, obituaries a lot more candid and open now about if there's same-sex marriages in the family, and the you know, relatives that people leave behind. And sometimes I count up, sometimes people, and they acknowledge in their obituary that they were married 3 or 4 times. And, you know, the children, especially if they're children by, you know, various marriages, it's just accepted. You know, that's the way it is now. You know, I think obituaries differ if it's terribly, you know, terribly tragic, if it's sudden, if it's you know, we know that the shooting of the insurance executive yesterday morning in Manhattan. Well, that's a news story, but at some point, probably, you know, the media is going to also cover his funeral, and somebody may write a very traditional obituary, but there may never be. Maybe in their hometown in Minnesota, I think it is. I bet there'll be a traditional obituary. But you know, it's people are more candid now about if somebody was a victim of a crime, or if it was an unexpected death. They don't really need to say old age anymore because, given the age of, you know, we can see the age of the person. Um, so over the years, this template evolved, and we have this as one of your research sheets. In that, you know, these are the key things. It's an announcement. It's an announcement that this person and their age died, and where, when, cause of death, almost always the cause of death. Um, Newspapers like the New York Times have to have it confirmed, um, so that if somebody calls and tells them, um, you know, um, oh, and be talking about Woody Allen later. If they called and said Woody Allen died, the newspaper has to have confirmation from a family member or a press representative or a hospital. And then there's a short bio, and who the person is survived by, funeral information, usually a photo, and not too long. Uh, they vary in length a lot. Um, so I was looking at a lot of obituaries recently. So Maggie Smith, the British actress who died just a few weeks ago, this is the lead on her obituary in the New York Times, which was front page, and then it jumped onto a later page. Very much who, what, when, where, why was she important, and particularly her work that she was known for, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie and Downton Abbey. And she died suddenly. She was 89. Well, no, I made up suddenly, but death in a hospital. And they did not specify cause of death. And lots of people don't. And there's nothing that says you have to. But I love this comment about her, this detail about her, that this was in her New York Times obituary. She said she'd never seen an episode of Downton Abbey, and, quote, it got to the point where it's too late to catch up. And she never saw the feature films either. And I thought, okay, now there's something that they found in an interview she'd given, not too long ago, in which she said she'd never seen the program that she's probably these days most known for. Somebody pointed out to me, and I'd read this, I got the newspaper out of my recycling bin. Marshall Brickman, who died just a couple of days ago, in his obituary was in, I think that's Monday's paper. And he co-wrote all those Woody Allen films with Woody Allen. And then he also wrote Jersey Boys, the Broadway musical, and a lot of other things. And he died on Friday, and he died on Friday. On Sunday, they interviewed Woody Allen about him. And because nobody worked more closely with Marshall Brickman than Woody Allen. And Woody Allen gave a great little anecdote about how they lived across Central Park from each other. One of them was on the west side of Manhattan, one was on the east side. And every morning, one of them would walk over, and they would just sit and talk. They weren't trying to go too deeply into what they were working on, but their scripts, their dialogue came out of their talking. And at this point, I thought this was great. The New York Times doesn't have to mention Woody Allen's shady background, because which they've written about for 25 years, because that's not a part of the story. And of course, when he dies, it'll be a big part of his story, but it was not a part of his story with Marshall Brickman. And Jean Nivitch, who was the founders of Weight Watcher, and wrote her book. And in her book, she said she never ate dessert in public, but at night, by the light of the refrigerator, she would gorge. And then one day in a store, a neighbor said, "Oh my gosh, when are you due?" And she was not pregnant; she was overweight, and that was enough to set her going and starting Weight Watchers. And then just some candid ones, just some very ones that I've seen recently. One was this woman who, at 100 years of age, was running marathons and winning races, and she didn't start running until after she was 100, and she died at 108. And she donated her body to a university studying longevity. And I just thought that was a really interesting obituary. A couple of years ago, the New York Times, it was brought to their attention that for 150 years, their obituaries had been about white men. And that was it. So the Times has been going back, and a couple of times a week, they write an obituary of a woman or a person of color, or a man maybe, who didn't get an obituary when they died. And one is Charlotte Bronte. And so they wrote an obituary for her. So they're very well-known people. And then Go One Go Mohawk, an indigenous actress from the 1880s, and they had background on her and photographs. And And she was really, really popular and well known and toured around vaudeville houses and and then Maria Oroso, the inventor of banana ketchup, which I guess is a thing in the Philippines. And so I think that's really great that they're looking at people who in their day did not warrant an obituary. And I love this one. This one just ran the other day. A woman who grew up and when she was 19 or 20, got a job with I think R.H. Macy was a distant cousin, and he had this little dry goods store on 34th in Manhattan. And she asked him for a job and went to work there. And she basically led the store for decades and was considered the brains of the establishment. And however, when he was getting ready to really name a successor, he passed her over and she ended up retiring. But that was one of the most interesting obituaries I've read in a long, long time, and there were sketches of her and photographs of her. So there are some rules or guidelines. Some people break them. I found an obituary by a man who, writing about his father, said, "We've all done our best to enjoy weather, Robert's antics up to this point. Now he's God's problem." So another died with the request that his family work to get Congress to repeal daylight savings time. Yay! Yes. And then I love this one, William Ziegler, not the author, who died in 2016 to avoid having to make a decision in the pending presidential election of that year. And that won the year's funniest obit award. Here's one which must have taken a lot of guts or foolishness to put into print. In writing about their mother, in 1962, she became pregnant by her husband's brother. She abandoned her children, who were then raised by her parents. She passed away and will now face judgment. She will not be missed by Gina and Jay, and they understand that this world is a better place without her. Wow. Wow. So they got the last word on that. I don't know what town that was in, but I hope they had a good laugh. Here's an obituary, a woman who died in her sleep at age 94. According to her obituary, cause of death was believed to be from carrying her oxygen tank up the long flight of stairs to her bedroom that made her heart give out. Written by her son, he wrote, "She left behind a hell of a lot of stuff for her sons and daughters who have no idea what to do with it." So that's a respectable, funny one. So this is one by a man I knew in Oregon who worked with my father in public broadcasting. And his obituary said, "In lieu of flowers, he asks you to take time in his name to visit the elderly, especially those you know." And I thought that, I don't think that was an accident. I think he was being funny. He was very quirky. And I just thought that was very funny. And then you can write obituaries about your pets or include them in yours or have separate ones for them. Brian was a lover of couches and blankets. He had many hobbies. His favorite activities included barking at things not there, cuddling alongside you, taking over his mother's bed, licking his butt, acting like a spaz when it was time to be fed, and trying to figure out who exactly was the good boy. So, key things to remember is be sure and interview or have a good discussion with someone who is thinking of writing an obituary or is working on an obituary. Make sure you talk about dates, their birthplace. Most obituaries will mention their parents, their siblings, who is, and then who survives them as far as children, and their schooling and what they did in their retirement years, and special interests or hobbies they had. And I think the best obituaries tell a story. You tell a story about a person so we get an idea of who they were. So it wasn't just Mark Twain who lived to see his own obituary. It's not uncommon that obituaries have run without a confirmation of death. Paul McCartney, Mark Twain, Ronald Reagan, Queen Elizabeth. I had no idea there's so many of them. And that's why, and in that documentary about the New York Times obituary writers, they say, about a couple of times where they've been caught with, somebody phoning up and saying, "Hi, I'm Joe Smith, and you wrote my obituary this morning, and I'm still here." So we put together some resources for you. There's a lot of help online. I mean, there's like everything else online. There's just an enormous number of articles about writing an obituary. Your church or funeral home will have some ideas and contacts. The bottom of the Seattle Times website has advice about submitting an obituary. If you're working with a funeral home, they will do it for you. I think what a really good idea is to write two versions, which I did for my friend whose husband died. The shorter version ran in the Seattle Times. The longer version was at his memorial service and was on the inside or the back of the memorial service program. So maybe write, two versions. And scams, like everything else these days. Do you remember when they used to say, don't put the address of the home where the deceased lived because everybody will be at the memorial service or funeral and the house will be empty and you can go burglarize it. A lot of houses were burglarized. I remember those days well. So, but there are all kinds of other scams out there, especially if you go into a lot of detail on the obituary with date of birth and names and so I have some information about scams and just I guess it goes with everything else that's going on right now. It's just you have to be careful about that. And I know the AARP addresses obituary scams too online. So identity thefts and I don't know if they still have somebody guarding the home if they're away from the services. And anybody here know the work of Trudy James, who was a longtime Seattle activist? She was an interfaith hospital chaplain. She was an AIDS worker. She wrote and filmed and documented a lot of end of life resources and research. There's a documentary about her called Speaking of Dying. And she, in the 1970s and 80s, when men here in particular were dying of AIDS, she was very much a champion for their cause and to be treated with dignity and be able to die with dignity. And I think that is everything, but I'm very interested in your questions or if you have started an obituary and don't know. Yes, Emily.
Everyone who registered online will be getting the handouts that we had in person.
Okay. Yeah. So everybody who's Zooming this will get from Emily the handouts that we're talking about. You'll get it via email. So there are a lot of resources and ideas for obituaries. Thank you. Tell me why you're here.
Oh, just out of curiosity, like I feel like a lot of the obituaries are very exciting.
Yeah.
So just kind of curious about how
Yeah. Good. Okay. And do you have any questions?
What if somebody deserves something funny?
Yeah.
But I'm not a funny writer.
Well, do you have a mutual friend that you could ask them? Or can you remember? Ask the people close to them. Do you remember something funny that they could share with you? Yeah. So you're writing a friend's obituary, maybe.
Actually, I helped write a friend's obit last year.
Yeah.
And my brother-in-law is probably coming up So
Yeah,
I was hoping to help my sister with
Yeah.
that.
yeah. Has she brought it up yet?
They are not talking about.
Well, that's a whole nother situation. And there will be friends and family that don't want to talk about it. And that doesn't mean you can't kind of keep a few notes
Yeah.
that might help her later.
Yeah.
But I heard on NPR today a story about a young girl who was dying, and they decided not to tell the school or the family friends, and how they realized what a mistake that was because it isolated her further. And I, what I learned is that it helps a lot to talk and to have the courage to talk to somebody who is going through this and and listen, you know, and do things that as far as offering help, go beyond the casserole. And I know my brother and a friend of his, they would come mow our lawn when my husband was dying, and that was so great. That was just, I wasn't going to have the time. My husband couldn't do it. It was just a very practical, practical things can be very comforting, very supportive, very loving. Yeah. Yes.
I do have a question.
Okay.
In the chat, the first one is, are there resources at the library to write an obit in another language, for example, run in English and Spanish? So.
Oh, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
Do you know?
We don't have translation services for documents currently. So that could get a little hard. Librarians who speak multiple languages translate it. That might work, but we don't have translation services at the library.
Yeah, I bet there's some place in Seattle that could help with that. Or maybe they're not in Seattle, but yeah, the question was obituaries in in a foreign language, another language. I know that the New York Times now can publish both, and if you're a Spanish speaker and reader, you can read the news story in Spanish. And I don't have any idea what that software is like, but that's a good question, and I bet if they're on Facebook or they're online, they can find an answer probably. Yeah, was there another question?
Yeah, we have one more. What are some of the non-traditional forms of obits?
Okay, non-traditional forms. Well, social media. Um, I see a lot of things on Facebook, but that's more of the boomer generation, I think. I have kind of a new friend, a friend of a friend, who lives in the East, and she's been going through cancer treatments, and she has thousands of followers, thousands, because it just so happens her daughter's also missing in Washington State. She was a hiker, and I've been getting to know the mother, and a friend and I might write about this someday. And she, so on Facebook, just there still are a lot of people that follow cases, and I don't I know Twitter and TikTok skew younger, so I don't know what a younger person would do. Probably be social media and word of mouth. Um, I don't know if they would use traditional forms of communicating that. I'd like to know what they would do. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Was there something else that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do do you think that is it like common for folks to write their own obituary and then leave it, or is it something where you should have a conversation with your parents or your grandparents so that you can create it once they pass away? Like for like normal people who aren't getting it written by writers in the Times, things
Okay.
like that.
Are you talking about you mentioned your own?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
if I'm writing, like if my grandparents, if they pass away, my parents.
You're writing theirs.
Yeah.
I think this could be an opening. You could, next time you see them, say, I just went to a talk about, can I talk to you and write down some dates for you or help you, I think anybody over 60 has probably thought about, they're thinking about death, they're thinking about their obituary, and maybe this would be a way to tell your grandparents you can help them. I see also there's certain kind of, I'll call it merchandise, that if you buy something and they send a question each month to your loved one that would prompt them to write in a journal or to prompt them to write about a period of their life. So there's that kind of prompt. But only you would know if your grandparents would be open to this.
So I guess it's kind of like on both sides. If you're the older adult, maybe talk to the younger folks in your life.
Yeah.
And start saying like, I'm thinking about writing it. It's going to be here. This is what I want put in the paper, and kind of the other side of things.
Yeah.
You can ask.
And a lot of people, I told a friend yesterday who is also what kind of in a widows club that we just meet for Christmas lunch every year. And all our husbands worked at Cairo Radio. There are 4 of us, and it's just a coincidence. But so she's been widowed. She's remarried. She's probably was going to be talking about. She was shocked that I was going to be talking about writing an obituary. How could she be shocked? I don't know. Her parents have died. Her husband died, and she was shocked. So I think there are people that there's going to be a wall of some sort that, and I don't think it means you're suddenly going to be hit by a bus if you're working on your obituary. But, I really think using this as a starting point for a chat would, or take the resource sheets to your grandparents and any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. I saw your picture in New York, on train or somewhere, or reading a newspaper, like everybody holds a newspaper.
Oh, me?
And
Oh, that picture.
it's late, yeah.
Okay.
Right now, so
Yeah.
I'm working a grocery store in the PCC. We have like 2 or 3 every day New York Times delivery. Almost like nobody touching.
Oh,
Look, this one, I was so surprised that people
Yeah.
reading.
well, of course, there
Now
was,
nobody's picking up the newspapers.
well, that was the source of information. There was radio,
Yeah.
and that's all there was. It was radio and newspapers. So most newspapers now just have one edition. And I know I go to, a friend of mine writes for the Wall Street Journal, and she had a story on the front page yesterday. I went to QFC to buy 2 copies, $5 each, and they never sell. They never sell out. Whenever they deliver the next day's papers, they take away the old ones. And I'm really sad that newspapers don't play the same role in our life that they used to. I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's the way it is. I still have 2 newspapers delivered, and then I read stuff online. But yeah, they're just, nobody buys them, or not many people buy them. And of course, you can come to the library, thank goodness, and read the newspaper.
Janet, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? We can hear it. Looks like your hand is raised. I'm not sure if you still have a question. I can ask you to unmute as well, that might help. Janet, if you still do have a question, let's ask it in the chat, and then I can get it answered for you. Oh,
Yes, I was wondering about those of us who are writing their own obituaries. Where is in your suggestions or recommendations where to store it, how to make it known to your family members? I always believe that by writing our own obituary, we're the ones that know ourselves the best. And again, all those dates and information. And I don't know that anyone could really portray it as well as I could, but how to make this known to others or to know that this is what you prefer.
Okay, I think I've heard her. What you're writing your own obituary? You're writing your own obituary, and what do you do with it? For the meantime, is that what she was asking? Well, mine is in an envelope with my brother's name on it, and it's on top of a copy of my will, which I still tweak a little bit, and they're on my bedroom bureau. But I think I've given him a copy too. And I think, we really need to exchange those because he's older than I am and not just sit on the bedroom bureau. And then I update the obituary. I think I need to rewrite it. It was too long, and I don't think every place I ever worked in, I don't think it matters that much. So I'm going to cut it. But you could write a couple different versions. But I would just tell your family, or at least somebody in the family, this is in my desk drawer. This is in my, if you have a bank, what's it called, a bank? Called a safety deposit box. Thank you. If you have a safety deposit box, if you have an attorney who, would probably have a copy too. And I don't know, if I was my age, I'd just leave it on the bureau drawer, I think. Um, but my mother lived to 98. My brother and I wrote her obituary after she died. It was easy to do. And I wrote my father's when I knew he was failing, and he was in broadcasting and I was in broadcasting, so that was easy for me to write. And just let somebody know that you've done it. But try and tell a story.
Especially for an older person, it's a puzzle what picture to.
Yes, that's a really good question, because you'll see, or sometimes if the family can afford it, they'll be now and then.
Yeah.
There'll be the older one, and maybe at the bottom of the column is the younger one. And what do you think?
We went with older, but
Yeah.
then where do you, especially if they've had a long illness,
Right. What is older?
Where do you cut it off?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would go with a flattering.
Yeah.
I would go with something that makes them look good. And maybe was it taken the day before they died? Or, I don't know. I see that all the time, that families aren't sure. They you what to do. And I think, especially their adult life, that's the people who are going to probably see the obituary, probably knew them in their adult life when they were an adult.
Yeah.
And that would be a good picture. Maybe if you're sending the obituary also home to your Kansas hometown's newspaper, the weekly newspaper, you might want to send both pictures. Yeah. And I've been surprised. There are, I can think of a couple of people who I knew their parents, and their parents were, well known in their own kind of niche. And the children decided not to have an obituary. And I really, I was kind of offended by that. It isn't, it's not for you. I don't think it's for the family. I think it's for the community. I just can't, I don't understand that. And it's, I can't ask them, how come you never had an obituary for your mother? But I would guess, I shouldn't play psychologist, but that there's something there that maybe he wasn't as close to his mother as we all thought, or there was something, we didn't know, but anyway. Yeah, sure.
I was just saying, we don't, if
Oh.
you have one more question, we're about 2 or 3
Sure.
minutes until the end.
Okay. Yeah. Any more questions? We'll have to find out about the translation services. That's a really good question.
And then we also did just have one person in the chat that had a book recommendation.
Oh,
The poet Victoria Chang wrote a book of poetry titled Obit.
okay. Oh, good. That sounds interesting.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and and I'd love to hear from anybody that has some other suggestions, and we've been asked if we're going to do this again, and we think so.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, everyone online, we are sending you the resources. You should get an email tomorrow. And then, we will also have a recording of this. So if someone wants to watch it later and play back some of the questions, you definitely can. And we'll make sure to get you the link when that's posted on YouTube.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. Those of you out in your warm homes and everybody here in the library. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.